All right, let's explore a scheme that has been touted as a way of storing carbon to supposedly save our existence on the planet. Carbon capture and storage. Now, carbon capture and storage, otherwise known as CCS, has been heralded as a groundbreaking solution for our climate crisis. But let's get real. This so-called solution is more a smokescreen than a silver bullet, which allows polluters to carry on as usual whilst governments throw taxpayers' money at a technology that's not just unreliable, but in many cases barely functional. Ed Miliband, the UK's Energy Secretary, has thrown £22 billion at it in his delusion that it will help solve what some tout as a climate crisis. Carbon capture sounds like a futuristic idea that should work wonders, but the reality is far less rosy. In fact, it's costing us billions for little to no measurable impact on global carbon emissions. Firstly, let's take a look at what carbon capture actually means. So in theory, it's a relatively simple idea. Capture carbon dioxide emissions from industrial processes or power generation and then store them deep underground. Yet, in practice, it's a very different story. These projects require extensive infrastructure, they're costly to implement and even more expensive to maintain. Capturing carbon on a large scale means building vast networks of pipes and storage sites to funnel CO2 underground, a process that can be risky and highly inefficient. The potential for things like leaks and the impact on local ecosystems are just a couple of the problems that come with it. So if you really believe that carbon is the problem, although for me the jury is out, hiding it underground and hoping for the best surely cannot be the answer. It's like putting a plaster on a wound whilst ignoring the infection festering beneath it. The biggest issue with carbon capture is that it's just a flaky gimmick that gives polluting industries an excuse to just keep on polluting. It's no coincidence that many of the companies pushing carbon capture technologies are also some of the largest fossil fuel corporations. Think about it. If you can keep extracting and burning oil, gas and coal, all the while that you're claiming you're working towards carbon neutrality through carbon capture, why would you ever stop? In effect, what the scheme actually does is lets these industries greenwash their image, persuading the public and governments that they're part of a solution rather than a problem. And where does that leave us? Dependent on fossil fuels, with billions spent on a technology that hasn't delivered on its promises. And to make matters worse, carbon capture is incredibly expensive. Each carbon capture plant costs billions to develop, and the return on that investment is pitiful. Existing facilities, and there are some, barely scratch the surface of emissions reduction on a global scale. And in fact, the few large-scale carbon capture plants that do exist capture only a tiny fraction of worldwide emissions. And in many cases, these projects end up costing so much that the companies simply abandon them, leaving taxpayers like you and me to foot the bill. The Kemper project in Mississippi, for example, it spent over $7 billion attempting to implement carbon capture before finally giving up. I mean, what an enormous waste of public funds. Ed Miliband in the UK, he's the Energy Secretary, is planning to invest £22 billion worth of hard-earned taxpayers' cash on a carbon capture scheme. And here's the real irony. Carbon capture often doesn't even reduce emissions. Much of the carbon captured today is used for enhanced oil recovery, where the captured carbon is injected into oil wells to extract even more fossil fuel from the ground. So let's get this straight. We're capturing CO2 only to turn around and use it to produce more oil. It's mind-boggling. This isn't reducing carbon emissions, it's merely shuffling it around and finding ways to produce even more. The supposed green technology in this case actually leads to more fossil fuel extraction, a very bizarre contradiction if we're supposedly working to combat climate change. So what should we be doing? Well, we already have several tried and tested solutions that actually work. We could increase our renewable energy sources like wind and solar, I'm not opposed to those, and hydro, which are relatively affordable, they're scalable, and crucially, they don't rely on hiding carbon underground and hoping it stays there. And the most obvious one, of course, investing in those green technologies to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels altogether. We could be planting more trees. Yeah, it's really basic, offering a simple and more sustainable way forward. Natural solutions are the way. Reforestation, that would capture carbon. Planting trees, cheap, effective, genuinely absorbing CO2. Nature has actually already provided us a carbon capturing technology that doesn't require billions of taxpayers' subsidies or complicated infrastructure. It's called forests. But while projects like these might seem less profitable for the big corporations, they're far more beneficial for the environment and the public. There will always be a need for fossil fuels. They have their place too. Ultimately, the issue with carbon capture isn't just its inefficacy, it's that it diverts our focus and resources away from real solutions. Every dollar or pound poured into a carbon capture scheme is one that is not invested in renewable energy, conservation, or innovative green technologies. And the worst part is, by leaning on carbon capture as a solution, we're letting big polluters off the hook. They get to carry on with their emissions, their heavy operations, whilst painting themselves as environmentally conscious. It's a public relations strategy disguised as an environmental solution. Carbon capture may sound like something out of a sci-fi movie, but in reality, it's an expensive distraction from meaningful progress. True climate solutions will require commitment, accountability, and yes, perhaps some sacrifice from the very industries that have profited from the most pollution. So instead of wasting billions on unproven, shaky technology, we should be doubling down on things like reforestation and sustainable practices that are proven to work. As I said, there'll always be a need for fossil fuels, and some would also include fracking and nuclear as part of the mix. But in the end, if you believe that carbon is the problem, carbon capture is little more than an expensive crutch, propping up industries that should be looking to evolve or wind down, not revamp up their production. Let's not be misled by the promise of carbon capture. It's a mirage, a costly illusion that threatens to delay real climate action when we need it most. The time has come to stop pretending that there's a quick fix and to start investing in solutions that are truly sustainable. It's high time we turned our attention and our resources to real, lasting ideas rather than wasting it on false promises of carbon capture, which, once hailed as the miracle solution to our climate woes, is increasingly being seen for what it is, an eye-watering, expensive distraction from genuine environmental progress. Imagine spending billions to suck CO2 out of the air, only to stash it underground like a dirty secret. It's the classic sweeping the dirt under the rug approach, giving polluting industries a convenient excuse to continue business as usual rather than reduce emissions. Let's be real. This technology has barely scratched the surface of the emissions problem. Even at full capacity, existing carbon capture facilities capture a tiny fraction of global emissions. But the worst thing about it, companies pushing carbon capture often receive huge subsidies, meaning taxpayers foot the bill for a solution that doesn't actually solve much. Why not invest in cleaner, proven alternatives, renewable energy and reforestation? Planting trees is cheaper, natural, and actually works. Carbon capture sounds like something out of a sci-fi film, but in reality, it's just another way for big polluters to greenwash their image whilst raking in profits. If we're serious about climate change, we need action, not high-tech illusions.